So welcome everyone to the One Health Seminar Series. Sorry, my computer's freezing. Okay, this series is organized by the University of Guelph One Health Institute and graduate students enrolled in the One Health Collaborative Specialization. My name is Nicola May, and I'm an MSc student in the Department of Pathobiology and also one of the One Health students. It's my pleasure to be facilitating this seminar today. With great respect, we acknowledge that the University of Guelph resides on the ancestral lands of the Ottawandaran people and the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We uphold the significance of the Dish and One Spoon Covenant and the continuing relationship our Indigenous neighbors have with this land. We recognize that this gathering place, and all the places we are joining from today, is today home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people, and acknowledging them reminds us of our relationships to this land, where we explore, share, discuss, and learn, and our shared responsibilities for human, animal, and environmental health. Before I introduce our speaker today, I wish to inform you that we are recording this seminar. The recording will be posted to the One Health YouTube channel, and a link will be made available on the One Health Institute website. The recording may also be used by the One Health Institute in the context of promoting and showcasing One Health work being done on our campus. If you have any questions or concerns about the recording or One Health generally, please contact us at onehealth@uoguelph.ca. At the end of the seminar presentation, you will be able to ask questions. You can do this either by turning on your microphone or typing the questions in the chat. To ensure that everyone is familiar with chat function and to help us know who is joining the seminar, please take a moment now to indicate in the chat if you're an undergrad student, graduate student, or faculty or staff member, and what department you're from. If you're joining us from outside the University of Guelph, please tell us what your institute or organization is. Okay, awesome. Thank you, everyone. It's nice to see different departments coming to these seminars. It's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Graham Taylor is an Associate Professor of Engineering at the University of Guelph, a CIFRAR Azrieli Global Scholar, an Academic Director of NextAI, and a member of the Vector Institute for Artificial Intelligence. At the University of Guelph, he leads the Machine Learning Research Group and is interested in statistical machine learning and biologically inspired computer vision, with an emphasis on deep learning and time series analysis. The title of his presentation today is How Experimental Psychology Can Help Explainable Artificial Intelligence. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Taylor today.
Thanks a lot. I'm really happy that this is a graduate student organized seminar, and I'm also really happy to see everybody in the chat saying where they're from. Of course, it's dominated by graduate students, but it's great to see also representation from other institutions and also representation from industry. So I'm gonna again share my screen and bring my slides up. And I'm going to put my presentation to presenter mode. Okay, and I'm going to assume everything is good, and you'll let me know if my slides aren't there in front of you, but it looks to me like they are. So this talk is about how experimental psychology can help a subfield of artificial intelligence called XAI, or Explainable Artificial Intelligence. And this is really the result of a year-long collaboration with Eric Taylor, who's a postdoc at the Vector Institute. And he actually got in touch with me back in 2018 and said he, as a psychologist, had some ideas for how his work and his colleagues' work might be could impact machine learning and artificial intelligence. And then more recently, we recruited a master's student called Shashank Shekhar, and he's been working with us since January to bring some of these ideas to fruition. And Shashank is an engineering background with an interest in computer science. He's the technical lead on the project. Okay, so just a very quick one slide overview of the types of things my research group is interested in. And I do this just to give you a bit of background on who I am and what my group's doing. So you're going to see a whole bunch of bubbles here with acronyms in for project titles, and then the larger set of symbols are basically just areas of interest. So I'm not going to focus on individual projects right now, but I am going to focus on the key areas. So most of you are probably aware that machine learning systems need to be trained with data, and the easiest type of data to get is called unlabeled data. It's just like YouTube videos or text that you can scrape from the web. But the most valuable type of data right now for machine learning systems is data that's annotated from humans. And this is costly, and it also limits the type of data you can get. So we're actually interested, as many people are in machine learning, is training models with less labeled data. And so that's LWLL. We have a number of projects in that area. Of course, we're interested in explainable artificial intelligence. That's what I'm going to talk about today. We're interested in generative models. So you're probably familiar with machine learning and predictive models. So predicting the weather, predicting a future stock price, predicting whether you'll default on a loan. And these models are producing a generally simple output like a category or a number. But generative models are different. They produce creative inputs, high dimensional inputs. You might have seen some media attention around neural nets that generate images of people's faces, or neural networks that are generating essays that students could be then handing in for credit, or generating fake news articles. These are the outputs of generative models. We're interested in these models, and they require a lot of computation. So a recent project is looking at how to make these accessible to university researchers and not just the Facebooks and the Googles and the Amazons of the world. And so a lot of our projects focus on computer vision. So that's teaching computers to see. I'll show you a number of examples in XAI today that deal with computer vision. We have a new collaboration going on with the Biodiversity Institute, and this is going to be a pretty large scale effort to apply machine learning for biodiversity. So we're interested in doing things like using computer vision to count species or re-ID animals in the wild. And then we also interested in unusual types of inputs to machine learning. So you've probably, if you've had experience with machine learning models, you've seen them be fed vectors of data. So people's attributes like their name and their age and their postal code, or you've seen things like images or videos fed into a neural net to produce these predictions. And a lot of data is not structured like vectors or higher dimensional versions of them, which we call tensors. They might be structured as graphs. So like molecules or social networks, or an epidemic that's occurring right now. These are often best represented as graphs. And there's a whole subfield called graph representation learning, which looks to apply the same innovations that we can do for vectorial data to these unusual types of data. And then the final theme in our group that's going on is something I call sequential decision making and forecasting. So that's predicting the future. And we have a number of projects on the go that are related to One Health. That's in this space. So we have a collaboration with Arel Food Institute on food price forecasting. And then we're also working with Vector on what we call the Economic Recovery Project in collaboration with the Ontario government, using anonymized cell phone data to find COVID hotspots. So anyways, that's just a one-slide overview of what we're doing. But today I'm going to focus on one aspect of this, which is XAI. And I'm going to tell you about one particular problem or project that's in the intersection of vision and XAI using response times. So the rest of the talk is going to go like this. I'm going to give you a brief intro to XAI, tell you about black boxes, and motivate the need for explaining AI systems. I'm going to then review XAI for non-machine learning experts. The students that are participating in the discussion this afternoon will have already received a paper up front. So I'll just be giving some highlights from this review paper. I'll then talk about an emerging area called artificial cognition. And this is specifically where we think machine learning scientists and psychologists can work together. And then I'm going to tell you about one project in our group that's taking an artificial cognition type approach. And this, again, for the students who are participating this afternoon, is the other paper that has been assigned for discussion. So I'll highlight that. Okay, so let's go into the first part of the presentation. So artificial intelligence powered by deep neural networks has reached a level of complexity where it can be difficult or impossible to express how a model makes its decisions. So what I'm showing you here is the popular AlexNet model. AlexNet converts an image to a set of probabilities of classes. So what is the most dominant object that's in this image? You can see its predictions on the right: leopard, jaguar, cheetah, and the probability that are being assigned to these labels. So AlexNet has enough operations that you wouldn't be able to manually perform what we call the forward pass, so image to outputs, in your entire lifetime. So if you're going to sit down and do it by hand, like on a piece of paper and a pencil, you would unfortunately pass away before you could compute that. So it's really impossible to go into AlexNet and inspect individual neurons because there's just so many of them. And we call this a black box problem because the net's decision appears inscrutable from the outside. Okay, I'm going to make a note that some people object to this terminology. They say, well, there's actually a white box. We can get inside and people like me can look at the numbers, but the numbers still don't make a lot of sense on their own, or it would take too long to analyze them. So either way, it's not really fruitful to inspect one neuron at a time. Okay, so nonetheless, even if the model itself is white box enough to examine the code, or its trained parameters, or the elementary operations inside it, it's difficult or even impossible to express how they combine to make this decision. For example, here on the class of the image. So there's an ethical and political need for AI systems that are explainable. Models that are biased against a particular group will yield predictions that are biased against that same group. And commercial models that are trained on biased data sets will treat underrepresented groups unfairly and inaccurately, as we see in the now famous example from Google, pictured on the left. And as many in the community learned this summer, biased data sets are a real concern, but the problem doesn't stop there. There are deeper, systematic causes of bias in machine learning. So I'd like you to stop and think, how would you feel about a machine learning model screening your application for a job and producing a summary for the HR team so that they can assess your application or all the applications that they're getting quicker? How would you feel about it producing a ranking of you and other candidates? And then the HR professional, again, taking a look at that ranking and using that as the basis for judgment. And so finally, how would you feel about a machine learning model just going ahead and choosing the person for the job? So the black box problem has motivated legislative bodies to give their citizens a right to know about AI, how AI makes these sorts of decisions. And in 2018, the first such legislation, which is called GDPR, came into effect in the EU, with more stringent versions happening in other jurisdictions. And so what these laws do is they give citizens a right to understand how AI makes its decisions when it makes decisions on their behalf. France's take on right to know legislation includes the communication of parameters, weights, and operations performed by the AI in some circumstances. But in light of what I just said, if you're going to give people hundreds of millions of numbers, how useful is this sort of information? So policy analysts are currently debating to what extent these laws are legal or even helpful. And so the real legal and ethical challenge for XAI is to reveal explanations that users find satisfactory and that make accurate and reliable predictions about AI behavior in general, but in terms of specifically fairness and safety. Okay, so I hope I've communicated at this point what's a black box and why do we care about explainable AI systems? What I'd like to do next is go through a few different types of how to explain AI systems. So XAI actually has a fairly long history. And as many of you may already be working with interpretable models, such as decision trees, you may have actually experienced interpretable AI. So this notion of XAI has had a huge surge recently, and it can be traced to DARPA's XAI program, which funds our lab's work, as well as some other researchers in the province. So the thesis that DARPA put forward a number of years ago is that there's a trade-off between performance and explainability. So models like linear regression or decision trees and many different types of clustering describe the relationships between variables in mathematically simple ways. And so while these models are interpretable, in many practical settings, their performance does not compete with deep neural networks. And their variants, such as convolutional neural networks, recurrent neural networks, more recently transformers, which are completely dominating NLP. And so these deep learning models have been gaining traction since 2012. And as such, this is where most of the XAI work is focused. So on the right here, we've got a plot in terms of the popularity of the term deep neural network, which is in red, over the years. And then we also have another plot of the term explainable artificial intelligence. And so what I want you to note is that XAI is almost exactly lagging the explosive growth in DNN research. So again, people are getting excited about deep learning, and these sorts of systems are dominating an industry, but then people are also realizing with the gained performance, they've lost a certain amount of interpretability of the classical models. Okay, so there's a number of excellent review papers that are out there for XAI, and notably, each of them presents the XAI literature in kind of a different taxonomy or organization. And some of them, they emphasize the importance of explanations for global versus local behaviors. Others categorize XAI techniques based on whether they're model agnostic or model specific. And as I was saying, about a year ago, Eric and I started working on this, and Eric's interested in advocating for an experimental psychology approach to generating explanations. So we put together a different type of taxonomy, which categorizes approaches to XAI, but what they can't explain or do, emphasizing the strength of our proposed approach. And so I want to say right now that we actually believe that existing XAI approaches can be powerful and intuitive and useful. We're not recommending that they should be abandoned for what we're presenting here. But what I'm trying to do is I'm going to review some of these existing approaches and tell you about their shortcomings. And this is to make a case that there's a blind spot, there's a hole to fill, and this will be replaced by or filled by experimental psychology methods. I'm not saying that existing XAI methods should be abandoned. There's a lot of great work out there. Okay, so the first type of model I'll point out is something called a proxy model. And this intuitive approach to explaining DNNs is basically, it's to create an adjacent model that has an interpretable architecture and then build it so that it makes similar decisions of the complicated model, the DNN. And we then use the simpler model's interpretable decisions as a proxy for the black box decision-making process. So in this picture here, I'm showing an approach that effectively distills a neural network, which is a complicated model, into an and or decision tree, which is a simple model and one that can be explained. So the downside of this proxy-based approach is that these sorts of methods will suffer a performance hit because we change to a lower capacity model. XAI has reached a point where researchers are training deep neural nets to interpret the predictions of other deep neural nets. So these AI for XAI solutions provide appealing explanations, but they have the obvious drawback of adding another black box to the system, thus inviting more explanation. Another complication with these methods is that the workhorse of deep learning, which is, I said before, is supervised learning with labels, is generally not an option because people already have trouble explaining their own actions and their decisions. And that makes obtaining the required ground truth to train a supervised learning model quite difficult. So the upside of these approaches compared to the last set of approaches is that they don't really suffer a loss in any predictive power because you're just training another model to predict or to explain the outputs of the original model. You're augmenting one deep neural net with another. And so unlike proxy models, which sacrifice some predictive power to incorporate an interpretable architecture, or introspective models, which train a second black box to explain the first one, some methods paint a picture of black box processing as is without altering the model design. And these correlative methods and saliency maps, what they do is they display the relationships models have learned. And in some cases, they highlight the subset of information in the input a model's features are weighting heavily in the prediction. So perhaps the most popular correlative technique is the family of gradient and activation visualizations, which are generally referred to as saliency maps, as you see pictured here. So in the top, you see an image, and then the bottom, you see one of these saliency maps, which is explaining effectively where the deep neural net focuses to make a decision. And you're effectively seeing which elements of the stimulus are related to the prediction. The issue here is that these saliency maps point to a manifold of explanations with no ability to specify the cause of a model's ultimate decision. In other words, many different combinations of data could produce the depicted correlation. And then finally, the output of some popular saliency maps resembles the output of simple edge detectors, which don't require any training and no special data processing. So people have argued that there's really nothing special about these XAI methods. So posthoc methods invite a human user to rationalize the cause of a model's behavior after having observed the explanation. So like the correlative techniques, posthoc explanations do not sacrifice predictive power in the service of explanation. Unlike the correlative techniques, they introduce some causal logic into explaining the system. So systematic perturbations, deliberate bottlenecks, or other kinds of manipulations. So let's consider one example that we have in front of us. And this is known as local interpretable model agnostic explanation, or LIME for short. And so what LIME does is perturb the input and see how the predictions change. The key intuition is that it's much easier to approximate a black box model locally. What I mean by locally is in the region of the prediction we want to explain, as opposed to trying to approximate a model globally, so for all possible predictions. And so this is done by weighting the perturbed images by their similarity to the instance that we want to explain. So say we want to explain a classifier that predicts how likely it is for this image that you see to contain a tree frog. So we take the original image on the left and we divide it like a puzzle into interpretable components. These are called contiguous superpixels. And so then we generate a data set of perturbed instances by turning some of the interpretable components off. And so that's what you're seeing next. Okay, and then as opposed to, for each of these perturbed images, we get the probability that a tree frog is in the image according to the model. And that's what you're seeing in the middle. Okay, so you've got 3 rows here. One is one perturbation. The second row in the middle is another perturbation. And then you have a final perturbation on the bottom. Okay, and then you have the probability of being a tree frog. Okay, and then we learn a simple linear model on this data set, which is locally weighted. So we care more about making mistakes in perturbed instances that are more similar to the original image. And at the end, we present the superpixels with the highest positive weights as an explanation. So we gray out everything else. And that's what you see in the final explanation at the bottom right. And so anecdotally, these explanations are very compelling. The downside is that these methods invite the user to project their own biases onto the explanation, especially the confirmation bias. So, hey, I see a frog's face. It must be the face that's most most important to use to make a prediction that it's a tree frog, or that's the most distinguishing feature. Okay. Oh, I've been talking for a while. I want to invite you to comment or ask any questions. So maybe this is a good time for me to take a pause, because I can ask you out there if anybody wants to reflect. Why do you think these particular pixels that are left over, namely the frog's face, explain the concept of a tree frog? Does anybody want to take a crack at that? I see a chat. Okay. Let's see here. Proportions, as in eyes to face to body. Very unique features of a frog. Shape of the head. Great. Okay. So you're coming up for reasons. Color is another one. Great. Of why the features that you're seeing left over, this is the facial region of the frog, are good features for making that prediction that is indeed a tree frog. Okay, great. And so what you're seeing here is that we're projecting our own understanding onto the interpretation of this output generated by the explanation model. Okay, so this is great, and that's why people like these sorts of approaches. But it's not totally automatic, right? The result, which is this image of a frog's head, is left for us to interpret and rationalize. Okay, so great. Thanks, everybody. Let's move on. All right, so the methods that we've described so far create explanations by trying to express how models work. Example-based explanations, which is the final class of methods I'm going to tell you about, find the limits of function and explain black box processing by interpreting their decision boundaries. And they apply counterfactual or adversarial or critical examples, as well as prototypical ones. So above, what we're seeing is on the left, we see a prototype-based explanation. So this is saying, okay, for a particular class, say dogs, these are prototypes. This is the examples in the data type that are indicative of the dog class. We can also have criticisms. Okay, so these are elements of the input space, but they're presented to the user when they don't fit the distribution of output labels to which they belong. So in other words, these criticisms present the user with outliers, cases where the model's behavior defies expectation. And these prototypes and criticisms are drawn from the input space, but we can also generate stimuli that tell us something about the model's decision boundary. So counterfactuals answer the question, how far do we need to perturb a model's decision boundary? Or sorry, how far do we need to perturb a model's stimulus before the decision changes? Okay, so this can be achieved by iteratively perturbing an input feature until the decision changes. So we make perturbations in the input space, we modify the image until the output of the model, in here predicting the class of the input stimuli, changes. And then we also attempt to minimize the required change because we want to understand the minimal perturbation to change the output of the model. And so by definition, these methods work iteratively and automatically, and they produce many examples of failure to form an idea of the boundary. They describe model function by illustrating its limits. So intuiting model behavior as a function of similarity, counterfactuals, adversaries, and criticisms involves interpretation with many observer degrees of freedom. So again, what I mean by that is similar to the lime explanation of the frog where you were delivered an image. Here you might be delivered a set of images. So there's a lot of cognitive load for you as a recipient to draw your own conclusions. And so we're actually advocating for a different approach that's maybe less automatic, more a priori, where scientists falsify select hypotheses rather than automatically generating a whole lot of different hypotheses. So this brings me to the next step, which is what's missing in XAI so far. clearly, this emerging field called XAI aims to increase the interpretability, the fairness, the transparency of these machine learning systems. And again, these techniques we've reviewed have a lot of explanatory power, but the human mind is also a black box, and cognitive psychologists for over 150 years have generated a lot of experience modeling it through experimentation. So we should translate the methods and the rigor of cognitive psychology to the study of artificial black boxes in the service of explainability. So what we argue here is that in XAI, there's a blind spot. So most of these approaches are generating explanations post hoc rather than a priori. They're not asking specific questions up front. They're just generating you a lot of information and ask you to interpret it. Most of the investigations are confirmatory rather than falsifiable. So they play into your own confirmation biases. You see the picture of the frog's head and you say, oh yeah, okay, of course, it's found the most salient features of the image. And then most explanations are automatic with many observer degrees of freedom. This is what I explained before. There's a lot of work for the recipient of this information to do or to interpret these explanations. So this blind spot can be complemented by experimental cognitive tradition. And what we're doing is we're proposing to conduct experiments to test hypotheses under falsifying conditions with very curated controls. So in other words, we're trying to experiment with black boxes the same way that psychologists experiment with humans. So the next part of my talk is going to quickly walk through a set of examples, not from the XI literature, but from the AI literature where people have taken this approach. We're not arguing that we're the first people to use psychology as an inspiration for XAI, but there are very few works that do this. And next, I'm going to basically point out a few examples of this that are inspiring us. And so what we're doing effectively is advancing a hybrid discipline that's called artificial cognition. And it was coined in 2017 by Ritter and colleagues. And artificial cognition can be thought of a branch of the machine behavior movement. And this seeks to produce cognitive models that are inferred from data elicited via experimentation rather than directly observed. And so what we're doing is we're suggesting a research pipeline that identifies a specific behavior and its environmental correlates, infers its cause, and identifies its boundary conditions. And so these steps mimic the arc of research programs in prominent psychology labs all around the world, and really in science in general. So nothing new is really, there's nothing new about these methods in science. One argument is just for doing this is often in machine learning, there's many great things about the field, but sometimes we're a bit sloppy in terms of how we do science. So we're trying to, in some ways, reintroduce a little bit of rigor back to the field. So these sorts of studies should be informed by attempts to alter behavior by changing the machine according to our theory of the machine's mind, which is something that psychology researchers typically cannot do. So here's a difference between psychology and machine learning. So we can actually get in and tinker inside the black box. We can change code, but you can't really do this, or at least when people started doing this in psychology, they weren't able to directly experiment on humans' minds. Okay, so once we have the idea of a cause of a behavior, we should actually be able to change that behavior by changing the machine. Again, this is not something you would do in a human, but it's an advantage you have in machine learning. When you're doing experimentation, you can actually use this knowledge to make the system better. So this kind of cogent experimentation following the arc I've described should produce pretty satisfying causal explanations of machine behavior. And so let me walk through each of these steps I've outlined here, again, with a few examples. So the first step in this process is to identify certain behaviors and establish them as subjects of study. What we want to do is correlate specific behaviors with changes in the machine's task, the way it's trained, its architecture, or the environment in which it operates. Okay, so standardized tests are very helpful for these purposes. In cognitive psychology, dominant paradigms produce thousands of published studies every year, and these are subtle variations on a relatively small set of tasks. ML researchers have also produced batteries of tests that are useful for assessing performance across a variety of tasks. So if you take the arcade learning environment, you might have heard about reinforcement learning agents playing Atari. This is a very popular benchmark. I was also showing you some images from Imagenet, which is a classification benchmark for computer vision. So as an example of this approach to XAI or artificial cognition, here's a picture from a DeepMind project that developed a behavior suite for benchmarking reinforcement learning agents, the type that play Atari now. And they benchmarked them across a variety of behaviors. So basic performance on a task, how it would scale, handling noise, its use of memory, generalization, its ability to explore its environment, and credit assignment. And so this allowed them to test specific hypotheses about how different RL agents, so this would be like almost like different groups of people, would perform on different tasks. And so correlations are insufficient to infer the existence of black box processes that cause behavior. So instead, hypothesized processes need to survive a fair test of falsification by exposing the machine to different kinds of circumstances designed to rule out alternative explanations. So one exemplary case of experimentation in machine learning comes from this investigation into shape bias in one-shot object recognition. So these are the same authors that coined the phrase artificial cognition. And what they did is they developed an experiment to see if deep neural networks would exhibit the same biases towards shapes as humans do when learning to detect new types of objects. So they borrowed stimuli sets modeled after tasks from developmental psychology laboratories that featured novel objects that can vary in shape or color, but they controlled the other major variables such as background. Okay, so their hypothesis was that shape rather than color would be a biasing feature when you were generalizing from known to novel objects. And so the model in this case was pre-trained with a state-of-the-art image classifier to provide basic feature detectors. And then the model was asked to identify the most similar image from a novel support set that included shape matching and color matching stimuli. The results showed that the model was much more likely to identify the shape matching novel object as belonging to the same category, and that confirmed a human-like shape bias in object identity learning. And so the crucial design feature was the perfect experimental control provided by the shape and color matching probe, and that isolated the causal variable. Okay, so next, investigations into psychology-inspired experimentation have also been used to discover properties of gestalt perception in neural networks. So Bean Kim and her colleagues asked whether deep neural networks for image classification exhibit the same law of closure, which is a behavior in biological neural nets that views incomplete shapes as a whole. So people do filling in when they see missing shapes. And so this is an exemplary experiment with clear predictions, independent and dependent variables, and conclusions. If you believe you can explain when a behavior happens, then you should also be able to account for when the behavior stops. So identifying the boundary conditions of behavior is one step towards explaining it, because it narrows the range of viable alternative explanations. And so more practically, it helps describe when a model or an agent is likely to change its behavior. And that's important for users, regulators, insurers, and developers. So for example, an autonomous vehicle may perform above human level under normal circumstances, but how does it perform under storm conditions or snow or through road work or when the lighting changes? So in one recent study, Richard Webster and colleagues psychometrically evaluated the item response curves of 5 different face recognition algorithms, as well as human performance under different degradation assaults, including a Gaussian blurring the inputs, changing the contrast, adding pink noise, and variable facial expression. So this resulted in a detailed description of the model's different abilities and faults. So the detailed item response curves illuminated some surprising conclusions. The authors originally predicted that deep learning CNNs would be uniformly superior to shallower networks or models with handcrafted feature detectors. But the experiment showed that VGG-face, a type of deep convolutional neural net designed to process images of faces, was the best algorithm in most circumstances for most intensities, but for a wide swath of the stimulus space, the handcrafted feature detector known as OpenBR outperforms several of the other deep CNNs. So this psychophysical approach also revealed the surprising discrepancy between the OpenFace system and FaceNet, which share architectural similarities because both are variants that are built upon the same Google-designed architecture. And this empirical discovery prompted the researchers to propose that differences in the training sets, not the architecture, used by these sibling models might explain the difference in their performance. Okay, so the final example of artificial cognition I'm going to show has to do with the last step that we recommend. I was saying you could get in and actually toy with the system's brain very differently than you would do in a human in the human setting in traditional psychology. Okay, so machines offer us this freedom to directly alter neural networks. So showing that selective tinkering corresponds to falsifiable predictions provides a strong test of any working explanation. And this really should be regarded as the highest level of explainability. So for machine learning researchers and creators, this type of experimentation describes further stages of development. So another interesting DeepMind project in this spirit is called PsychLab, which directly imports classic visual search tasks and other paradigms into a reinforcement learning environment to measure elements of visual cognition. So the Unreal Reinforcement Learning Agent showed exemplary performance relative to a human expert on visual acuity and contrast. And the researchers predicted that this Unreal agent would have a hard time learning small relative to large items and would be disproportionately distracted by the large items. This the experimental finding here confirmed the hypothesis. And so critically, the researchers used this experimentally derived causal insight to further develop this Unreal agent. They gave it a human-inspired foveal type of input where it has higher resolution in the central part of the input and lower resolution going output. And this advanced this particular type of visual agent. Okay, so for the final part of my talk, I'm going to present some recent ongoing work from my lab that embraces artificial cognition. All right, so how would you explain an AI's decision if you couldn't look inside the black box? In some sense, it seems like a ridiculous thing to do. Like, why would you ignore pertinent information, like the weights of the network, or the code, or the metadata associated with the data set and so forth? But the reason is that most of these techniques developed for XAI so far that use this kind of information, they depend on what we call privileged information. So having access to the code or the data sets used to train the model or the parameters of the model. And an example would be these saliency maps. We run this gradient descent procedure, which requires having access not just to inputs and outputs, but having access to the internals of the model. So we can easily imagine different situations where an explanation is desirable, but inspection of the model is impossible, for example, because of security concerns. So should we trust the creators of proprietary algorithms to tell us how they work? So in the interest of fairness and safety and oversight, we will need ways to produce explanations for models that we're not allowed to inspect. And so in this example, we have AlexNet taking an image as an input and responding with its top 5 predictions that I showed you before. And most XAI techniques depend strongly on knowing the details of the model, like I said, being able to interact and inspect its nuts and bolts. And so this is the situation I'm talking about. This is what we'd like to do. We've got the input, we've got its predictions, and so we'd like to produce explanations without knowing anything about the model itself. And so again, how would you explain AlexNet's decision if you don't actually have access to the model? You only had its input and its output. Okay, so fortunately for XAI practitioners that are interested in generating explanations from outside the black box, there's a very strong precedent. And this is what I was telling you about before. It's cognitive psychology. These same cognitive psychologists have had this problem for 150 years. Okay, so before modern neuroimaging techniques, psychologists were unable to look inside their black box. And these theories of human mind were developed by curated input and observed behavior. And historically, the first example of this was Franciscus Donder's response time measurements to identify the stages of processing involved in perceiving and responding to auditory stimuli. And so what I'm showing you here in this figure on the left is where Donders asked participants to repeat a syllable that was known to them. It's either known to them in advance or to repeat a syllable that they were unprepared for. And the additional time that was required to make the second type of response was interpreted as evidence that an additional stage of information processing in the human mind was dedicated to classifying stimuli and selecting the appropriate response out of several alternatives. So we'd like to use a similar type of logic applied to artificial neural networks, where we examine response time from outside the black box and make inferences about sequential stages of processing given tasks or stimuli of varying difficulty. Okay, so using response time methods on artificial neural networks leads to a problem. And so if you're familiar with artificial neural networks, this will be obvious to you, but if you're not, it might be surprising. So regardless of what's in the input we give to a deep neural network, its time to process this input will be about the same for 99% of the deep neural networks that are out there. And so we call them static. They process in static time, but it's very different than a human, where you ask them a question or give them a problem, and depending on the content of the problem or the question itself, they take a variable amount of time to respond. So directly applying response time analysis to neural nets has this problem. Is basically the neural net takes the same amount of time to process every single input, unless you do something different. And so a new class of models can provide the conditions we need for response time methods. So this family of models are called dynamic inference nets, and they use conditional computation. Conditional computation meaning that they do a varying amount of computation for each input. And the way that most of these systems work right now is they permit early exits based on the confidence of intermediate classifiers. So as you're aware, these deep neural networks have many layers, and the input processes through the network, generating representations, and finally gets to the prediction. The classification is typically made at the very end, but these dynamic inference networks have opportunities to exit at various internal layers of the network and make a prediction. So that's what I mean by early exits. And again, they're using confidence. So they're saying, if I reach a certain level of confidence that this image is a jaguar, then I'm going to exit with this jaguar prediction. If I don't have enough confidence, I'm going to move to the next level and next level and next level until I get the confidence, and then I'm going to make my prediction. And so because it can exit a different layer of the architecture for every input, it has a variable response time. So these models are useful in devices with limited computational capacity, like your phone, or that are restricted to time-constrained decision-making, maybe in an autonomous vehicle. They're certainly gaining popularity, and they've been designed from a resource efficiency perspective. And so in our toy example with AlexNet, we can imagine appending these auxiliary classifiers to intermediate layers of the network. And that's what you're seeing here with predictions being made at earlier stages, forcing the forward pass to quit early if a certain computational budget is reached or a confidence threshold is met. Okay, so we conducted our experiments on something called MSDNET, which you're seeing a picture of here. I'm not going to get into the details of MSDNET, but the important things is that it uses conditional computation or dynamic inference, and it has 5 intermediate auxiliary classifiers. And if hierarchical feature space is correlated with model depth and conditional computation allows early exits, then we can make predictions about feature space and response time. Okay, so here is our first experiment. We compared response times for images from 2 different data sets. We've got Imagenet, which is a popular benchmark. You see a chair from Imagenet on the left. The images in Imagenet look kind of like this chair. It's in sort of a canonical pose. It doesn't have a really complicated background. But there's this other data set called Objectnet, which is a test set designed to contain non-canonical object features that are generally absent from most of the training set. So if you train a model on Imagenet, you usually get a performance drop of up to 45% when you test it on Objectnet. So you see like the chairs here in Objectnet, they're rotated or they have a crazy background. They're taken from a different viewpoint. And then you can see some examples of like teapots. I think here are like teapots in a bathroom. So they're in sort of weird placed areas of the house, or like t-shirts. You can see a t-shirt sort of thrown on the bed here. And so this is what Objectnet is all about. It's very difficult classification to make. And so state-of-the-art models, so basically, what we're hypothesizing here is that it's going to take longer for these networks to process the Objectnet images than it is the Imagenet images because of the way that they've been collected. And so this is the basic experiment. It's quite straightforward. We measured the response time as the system clock time it took to process these images when we had this MSDNet with 5 intermediate classifiers. And if one classifier was insufficiently confident, we would just, the forward press would continue until the classifier had enough confidence, and then would make a response, or until it got to the very end, and then it was forced to make a prediction. And so in blue, we've got the Imagenet images. In red, we've got the Objectnet images. And so let's just take some illustrative cases, like 5 Imagenet images. These are the easy ones in blue. And then 5 Objectnet images, the hard ones, in red. And what I'm showing you here is on the x-axis, that's a particular confidence threshold. And on the y-axis, it's the time it takes to reach that level of confidence. So we actually, measured the time it took to get to each level of confidence. And this is discrete because there's only 5 intermediate stages. And so what you're seeing here for the blue images, the easy ones, it doesn't take them nearly as much time to reach a certain confidence threshold. That's why all these curves are basically shifted to the right and are lower. And then for the Objectnet images, you see that to just reach like a pretty low confidence, they need to go through several stages of processing. So they're shifted up and to the right. Okay, so it was just with a few examples, 5 chairs from each data set. We're seeing a pretty significant difference here. And if you look at the mean response time over the whole data set, Imagenet and Objectnet, there's a pretty significant difference here. It clearly takes more time to process the more difficult images. So that's not super surprising, but it confirms our hypothesis, and it's a easy to explain demonstration of how this thing works. So let's look at something a little bit more challenging. So this is about humans using object-to-object relationships and object-to-scene relationships to guide visual attention in naturalistic environments. And so it turns out that we're very sensitive to these high-level relationships. So we call them scene grammar effects. And these can actually be tested with certain data sets, namely this CGRAM database. And CGRAM has 62 sets of 4 images with different combinations of semantic and syntactic scene grammar violations. And so what you see here are specific kinds of syntactic and semantic violations. So these violations, they have been carefully controlled in this CGRAM data set. And each observation basically comes with 4 settings, basically semantically and syntactically consistent setting. You see in the top left, you have semantically consistent but syntactically inconsistent image, like the one here with the pot lid on the dishwasher. You have syntactically consistent but semantically inconsistent image, like the one in the bottom left, which is has a clock sitting in the drying rack. And then you have both types of violation happening. So a semantically and syntactically violated situation where we have a clock being placed on the dishwasher. So there's a consistent one. Oh, I forgot that I had zoomed in ones. Okay, so there's your semantic inconsistency, your syntactic inconsistency, the pot lid on the dishwasher, and then both types of inconsistencies. So what we see from human experiments is that humans have an easier time processing scenes with consistent grammar. And so you see in this bar chart here, the time it takes, or the dwell time for a human to reason about semantically consistent versus inconsistent, or syntactically consistent versus inconsistent. Okay, so the question is, what about deep neural networks? How do they perform? So if we look at these 4 different cases, we see our step plots for the response times for all confidence thresholds using a forward pass, using each of the 4 images from one scene as an input. Again, this is just an illustrative case of a particular scene. And in this example, this image with consistent scene grammar shows clearly better performance. It's shifted to the lower and to the right. It can reach a higher confidence threshold by remaining at the fastest classifier than when it processes images with inconsistent scene grammar. Okay, and so when we take the mean response time across the 62 scenes, we see the fastest response times for consistent images and slower response times for images with inconsistent semantics. And so I can't move my mouse over, but you'll see there's a gap. The blue curve pulls away from the other curves, sort of around confidence threshold 0.4. And so we did repeated measures ANOVA test, and the ANOVA test revealed a main effect of semantic inconsistencies, not syntactic inconsistencies. And this means that the model was selectively sensitive to features that defined object-to-object relationships. And that's actually not surprising to us, because this network was trained as an object recognizer, was not trained for scene classification. Okay, so in addition to predicting when these response time profiles should differ, we should also be able to predict when differences should not emerge. And so CGRAM also comes with clones of every image where the critical object has been removed. So no clock, no pot lid from the previous example. And because these images have no scene grammar violations, by definition, their response time plots should all basically collapse on top of each other. And they do. So that's kind of like a whirlwind of that experiment, but this is the end of my talk. So I'd like to conclude that these response time analyses can be used to make inferences about deep convolutional neural nets in dynamic inference models from completely outside the black box. All we need is a stopwatch. And these techniques lend themselves to a priori hypotheses testing about the relationship between the input space and a model's behavior. And these analyses should be used to form expectations for how models should perform in situations where explanations are desirable, but we don't have privileged access to the model, or we're not a machine learning scientist, we're just a user of the model. And so that's the important point here. And I want to obviously acknowledge the hardworking postdoc Eric and master student Shashank, who collaborated with me on these experiments. And you students have already been assigned the readings. There's the 2 papers there. And with that, there's some more info about our lab. Thanks a lot for your attention.
All right, thank you so much. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. I would like to thank our speaker for a fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to our discussion afterwards. This is our last One Health seminar of the semester. So we will be starting things up again in the new year. So keep an eye out for upcoming seminars starting in January. So thank you again for joining, and I hope everyone has a great rest of the semester.
I'll see you guys in a couple hours for the follow-up Q&A. And thanks again for the invitation. I'm sorry for going 2 minutes over to everybody else here.
Thank you so much.